And we are here in conference room 325 at the state capitol, as well as having members appear via video conference Zoom. Members, thank you. Today is our second hearing of the day. I want to thank you for your hard work and diligence. We have heard this morning some troubling new information provided to this committee about auditing practices by the Office of the Auditor that constitute a pattern that we're seeing that has emerged from both audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01. Over the last several weeks, we have heard and learned a lot from the Office of the Auditor about the importance of the Yellow Book standards or the government auditing standards, again, the Yellow Book standards. So before us members today, we have to testify with us is Mr. Edwin S.W. Young, recently retired from the City and County of Honolulu's Office of the Auditors. He's here to testify as to the applicability of the government auditing standards by the Comptroller General of the United States, the audits and matters being examined and investigated by this committee. Before we get started, I'll swear Mr. Young in, as this is part of Chapter 21 hearing. So if you'll stand, Mr. Young. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And let the record reflect that he answered in the affirmative. So, Mr. Young, I'll conduct some initial questions of this witness members. In your emails, we have two documents, Mr. Young's curriculum vitae and two documents that he has brought with him to the committee to help us guide our understanding of the Yellow Book standards as it applies to auditing practices, both here in the state, but nationally and to counties as well. So to start off with, Mr. Young, thank you for joining us. By way of introduction, can you explain your professional background to this committee and to the public?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully I can provide some insight on the government auditing standards, which applies to all government auditors at the federal, state, as well as city and county levels. A little bit about myself. Like Representative Kobayashi, I'm a graduate of the University of Southern California. Welcome, alumni. Also from the University of Utah. I've worked and retired from the federal government as a regional inspector general for the Small Business Administration. I worked as a director of internal audits for the California State University at Fullerton, and worked 20 years, almost 20 years, for the city of Palo Alto, which is a support city for Stanford University, and also as a city auditor for the city and county of Honolulu. In addition to that, I teach governmental accounting and also forensic accounting at the University of Hawaii, both at West Oahu and at Manoa, and teach at the graduate level and on the accounting school advisory board for the University of Hawaii, Manoa, particularly in the area of government accounting and also in forensic accounting. Just for your information, if you haven't read, and if I may blow my whistle a little bit, our offices have won multiple national awards for our audit products. And the Honolulu office was cited by the Institute of Internal Auditors as one of the top 20 auditing offices across the nation in North America. We've also won several leadership awards in government accounting and also in performance auditing. With that, let me terminate my whistleblowing and turn to discussions of the Yellow Book.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I appreciate the fact that you share with us your experience, because it's certainly your expertise that has brought you to this committee, and why we are looking to you to help us understand and then apply the Yellow Book standards to the audits that we've been inspecting, and which we have now pulled in another audit to inspect and to investigate further. We have heard much in this committee about the importance of government auditing standards, the Yellow Book standards. Can you explain what these standards are and how they are supposed to be applied by government auditing offices?
Sure. Most of the government auditing standards applies to all legislative auditors, both at the government level, whether they're city, county, state, or federal government. They must comply with the standards as espoused by the U.S. Comptroller General in what is called the Yellow Book. And these generally accepted government auditing standards are mandatory on all audit offices that are part of the government.
What does that mean by mandatory? Because we have heard some discussion that it's only guidance or a framework. What part of it is guidance, framework, and what of it might be mandatory?
The entire standard is an umbrella which captures, by reference, the auditing standards from the AICPA, Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the Institute of Internal Auditors, the Federal Accounting Standards Board, Government Accounting Standards Board, and many other entities, including the U.S. General Accountability Office, that are mandatory on all audit agencies that follow the government auditing standards. If that office is decertified, none of those audit reports or any financial statements issued by that office are considered accurate and credible. For individuals that sign off on financial statements, a CPA is required. And if that office is not certified, it does have a direct impact by the credit rating agencies such as Moody's Industrials that could result in the lowering of the bond ratings for the government entity. So for example, if the government financial statements are not considered acceptable, it would, and bonds are degraded to junk bond status.
Recording in progress.
In order to sell those bonds, the government entity would have to increase their interest rates in order to sell those bonds to investors, hedge funds, and other government entities. And that automatically results in an increase in debt service for the government entity issuing the government bonds.
Okay, so just to clarify, it is important that our offices, our auditing offices, comply with the standards, because there are impacts on the state's fiscal status.
It has impact both on credibility of the office as well as a financial impact on the government entity, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the things that we learned, and we've learned a lot about Yellow Book standards. So could you provide us some insights on how we wanted to go from start to finish? How it is that, what are the standards about the engagement process in determining the scope of an audit?
Before I answer that question, let me give you a little bit perspective on how most federal government inspector general offices are set up, and that serves as a model for most audit offices at the state level and also the city level. The inspector general office in the government consists of three components: the auditing arm, which does performance audits, and financial audits, the investigative arm, which are permitted with badges and guns to do investigations, and the management inspection arm, which basically goes through a checklist to say, yes, you have problems, and you said you're going to take care of it, so we're not going to report it. In the auditing division, they're required to report any type of fraud, waste, or abuse, and also to report any fraud that is detected, in addition to internal control problems or weaknesses that they have discovered during the course of their audit. Management may say, we're going to take care of the problem, we're going to resolve it. But the auditor under government auditing standards is still required to report the fraud and also to explain what management has proposed doing to solve the problem. And then there's a follow-up where the recommendation would say the government entity and the auditors would have to ensure that the fraud is appropriately resolved. They cannot drop the fraud or the instance of fraud. If they do, they're in violation of the government auditing standards. So having said that, performance audits is something like going to a cardiologist versus a general practitioner. It requires very specialized skills or the development of special skills that many offices do not have. They can do compliance auditing where they're going through a checklist, but being able to think innovatively to solve problems, to answer audit objectives requires special skills, special talents, and also special interpersonal relationships that encourage the auditee to tell you all that they know. One of the intimidation techniques that we are told not to do is to put a microphone or a tape recorder in front of the individual. That will immediately bias the interview so that the auditee is less candid, less truthful, and less open in discussing facts and figures for you. The other thing that you're taught is that during the interview, anything that is said during the interview must be corroborated by other interviews and other documentary evidence. The government auditing standards place heavy emphasis on sufficient, relevant, and credible evidence. In previous editions of the Yellow Book, they were further defined it as being, besides testimonial, documentary, analytical, physical, observation, and other types of very specific evidence that prove that fraud has occurred or prove that the audit finding is valid. In addition, they require the work papers to stand on their own so that an individual not involved with the audit can look at the work papers and come to the same conclusion as the auditors. The work papers must verify and document and provide convincing evidence that the finding is valid. And this is done by a third party, not by a party that's involved in the audit itself. Peer reviews do the same thing. They will also look at the work papers. So the work papers that are used to support the audit reports are basically open for the peer reviewers who are third parties looking at the office to ensure compliance with government auditing standards. The peer reviewers will start by looking at the printed and written audit policies and procedures to ensure compliance with the government auditing standards. If they are not in compliance and do not follow the government auditing standards, the peer reviewers will basically say, if there's non-compliance with government auditing standards, how can you be certified as being a GAGA's office? Having said that, they will in detail go through a sample of your work products to ensure that you are complying with the government auditing standards. The auditing standards, as we said earlier, requires sufficient, relevant, and credible evidence, and also is substantiated by a proper analysis of the data that supports the audit findings. Instead, as the auditing profession has evolved, it used to be in the 1970s, we got you, we're not going to tell you the audit results, we're going to surprise you with the audit reports and we'll fight you in the media. After several offices were dissolved because of the adversarial relationships with the auditee as well as the legislative branch, and their audit functions outsourced or their offices closed, GAO, like many other offices, started looking at themselves and started improving their operations so that their operations are value-added audits or reports that help management to improve the public administration of the government entity that they are working for. In that sense, if it is not value, it must be value added, and if it is not, then it is possible that the entity will be outsourced, as has happened in many cases in several cities in California. And the Yellow Book emphasizes independence and objectivity in the work of the auditors. Unfortunately, some offices have used this as a defense for their poor performance, their missing deadlines, or their inability to perform performance audits. And by casting blame and name calling, they've attempted to undermine the credibility of the audit products coming out. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're jumping ahead, and I really appreciate this because it's actually giving us a lot of context about how the auditing standards need to be applied. But can I shift your focus back to just, you talked a little bit about the field work. Can we talk a little bit about the scope of determining what an auditor is supposed to investigate? Yeah. What are the authorities that auditors are supposed to look at to determine what to audit?
Yeah, great. And thank you for reminding me. In many cases, the legislative arm, be it city council or state legislature, will issue a resolution requesting an audit. In that audit, for public accounting purposes, is considered a management letter. In it specifies the work the auditors are supposed to do or the objectives they are to answer during the audit. For example, in HART, the city resolution asks us to look at the public involvement in HART operations to ensure the credibility and accuracy of the information they're providing the city council. The government auditing standards requires that as a mandate and the scope of the auditor's work. In that context, the auditor has to provide a written plan of how they're going to answer those audit objectives. They will provide specific audit steps that will theoretically answer the objectives and answer the questions that the legislative arm has raised and asked them to answer.
So I don't want to put auditing offices out there on their own, because I know that when we look at and examine our resolutions for auditing reports, that in the instance of the SLDF and the ADC, they may be so broad. So in the instance when a legislative resolution may be broad, what should an auditing office do to further hone the scope of their investigation?
And in answer to that question, the normal procedures is to do preliminary research. So you're testing systems, you're testing transactions to see what the inputs and outcomes are. And this provides a framework of what the anticipated findings are. Based on the preliminary survey results or research results, it allows the auditors to scope down the extent of the audit they're going to do to avoid fishing expeditions. And by scoping it down within the context of the audit objectives, they are then able to establish specific steps and specific databases that they must test, specific transactions, specific contracts they must look at in order to answer the audit objectives. When they go into the audit phase, they basically have an idea based on their preliminary research what their potential audit findings are and what the potential report will look like. But then the validation of that null hypothesis, so to speak, is incumbent on providing credible and relevant evidence that supports the audit findings. If the audit objectives do not bear fruit or are not valid, the auditors are licensed under the government auditing standards to change their audit steps and the methodology to answer the question, but the objectives remain the same, the scope of the audit remains the same.
Okay, so one of the things that we've learned in the process of these investigative hearings is that there is a process at the state level where conversations are often entered into with the audited agency, and sometimes legislators, key legislators who may be motivating a particular audit. Is that part of the Yellow Book standards to be interviewing people who may be, who have a specific interest in the audit?
Yes and no. If it tells you, for example, where the information is that you need, for example, we're looking at heart and talking to the individuals as well as other interested parties, as well as people who are not working for heart. It gave us an idea of some of the potential issues that we would be looking at during the course of our audit. It would then tell us where the databases are, where the systems are, what kind of information was stored in a contract management system. Basically, who is involved, what is the organizational chart, who are the key players in the organization. Having said that, it gave us an idea of how to develop the audit steps so that we would be interviewing people who are considered credible and in a professional position to answer our questions. Having said that, we still are obligated under government auditing standards to substantiate what we're told in the interview by obtaining documentary evidence or analytical evidence or physical evidence that substantiated what the interviewer said. 9 times out of 10, the interviewer will say something, and then when we got into the field, we find that they sound good, they're policy statements, but they're not being implemented, and that in the field work, we find that what we're being told in the interview is not valid.
Okay, so you're speaking a little bit, and I think we had this conversation earlier in the committee, the differences between types of evidence. So if you could just restate that again, is certain evidence stronger than other testimonial evidence in the hierarchy of evidence that you see as an auditor?
Sure. The Yellow Book basically says credible, sufficient, and relevant information. It's a catch-all, and that includes whatever evidence that will support the audit finding. In the old books from the early days, where it's more specific, it is limited the evidence to testimonial, transactional, documentary, analytical, physical, and by observation. So in many cases, most auditors who are doing performance audits will look for the 6 different types of evidence that is accepted by the profession to substantiate their audit findings.
Okay. And those 6 types of evidence, for me to make it clear in my head, what are those 6 types of evidence again?
Testimonial, documentary, analytical, physical, observation, and also from computer systems, you take in data and you analyze the transactions.
Now, another thing that we've learned is that audits are done typically by teams, where you have analysts, sure, analysts in charge. As fieldwork is conducted, information is discovered, evidence is discovered. What are the standards around how to handle concerns, issues of non-compliance with law that may come to the attention of, say, an analyst who brings it to the team? What are the processes and procedures around how to handle evidence that may be raising certain concerns?
The auditors have to address it, and if they're going to disregard it, they have to annotate in their work papers why it was dropped, and the supervisor has signed off on it. For example, if they found fraud in a paycheck and it was considered not material and the supervisor said drop it, there would be an annotation in the work paper that said not material, dropped by so-and-so, the supervisor. But if it is material, then they have to develop it, document it, and report it. But they have to report it in such a way that if an investigation is underway or the prosecutor is initiating legal action because it's $1 million fraud, for example, They would report it in their audit report, but they cannot provide specifics that would compromise the investigation or the prosecutorial process.
Is there a standard where the auditor or the audit office needs to report to the audited agency as well as the commissioning authority body?
Yes, yes, they are required by Yellow Book standards to report it to the auditee, the management, and basically ask management for a response and or written comments. If they are not satisfied with the management response, the auditors will have to continue documenting the fraud and the extent of the fraud and the effects of the fraud, but they are still required to report it in their written report that is released to the public.
Okay. Question on the maintenance of records of an auditing office. How long are auditing offices supposed to retain documents related to an audit?
It varies among audit entities. Some of them have very short time frames. California, for example, has a 7-year requirement. It's a matter of individual judgment for the audit agency. And for like City and County of Honolulu, we establish guidelines for how long records of personnel, auditing records and any type of record has to be retained. So it will vary, but in that context, any work papers that are used to support the final report that is released to the public are in many cases considered public documents. They are releasable to the public or anyone who wants to take a look at the work papers. Work papers that were not used to support the audit report are still confidential and withheld from public view. If the work papers contain proprietary, sensitive, or classified information, there are ways of preparing the work paper so that the data is not compromised. These are some of the new techniques that many auditors have developed. For example, if personnel names and titles and social security numbers are kept on a separate list, but a reference number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is put on a table so that you can do the cross search. So you see number 1, you know who that is. That type of information is retained in the work papers, but the personnel name and social security numbers are not included in the confidential documents.
So we've gone through the fieldwork process. Once the fieldwork is completed, issues of concern have been dealt with, annotated, issues and objectives have been followed up. We learned from this process that then there's a stage where there's a preliminary findings and report that's written, and then independent review within the department, and then followed by sharing of the findings and recommendations, typically with the audited agency. Can you further illuminate how key or specific standards apply to those final stages of the audit process?
The audit, there are no specific standards to say what you have to do, but as the profession has evolved, they have adapted using the auditing standards to facilitate the process. So upon establishing your preliminary findings, for example, they will sit down with the auditee to say, this is our interpretation of the data and this is what it is showing. And are we misinterpreting it? And if they are, then the auditee has a chance to respond and to correct the perception and the analysis of the data. When the findings are finally drafted and put into a draft report, the auditee is given a copy of the draft report for their interpretation of whether the audit results are valid. The concept is no surprises. The auditee already knows what you're going to be issuing in your final report. So when you issue the final report to the auditee by Yellow Book standards has to be given a chance to respond to the audit report and the audit findings. If the response is written, it has to be part of the final audit report that is released. If it's verbal, it has to be paraphrased and incorporated into the body of the report, as this is what the management said in response to the audit findings. The concept is there's no surprises. The auditee already knows what's going to be saying, and he should also be taking corrective action to resolve the problem. If you have an adversarial relationship where the auditee says, I don't like what you've said, I'm not going to do what you're doing, and I'm not going to implement the recommendations, the auditor is stuck because auditors are prevented from government auditing standards from implementing the recommendations. Management is the only one that can implement the recommendations. Auditors are required to follow up a year or so later to check on the status of the recommendations. And if the recommendations are not implemented, the auditor basically has to revise the recommendations or change the audit report.
One last question, members, and then I'm going to open it up, starting with Representative Tarnas first. I wanted to skip back through one process because I don't want to miss this part of it. What was explained to us in the state auditor's process is that they have an independent review process.
Yes.
Where someone who is in the office who has done no work on the audit goes through and basically verifies each factual point, each sentence in the audit. Can you explain how the standards might apply to that independent review in the office before the draft goes out to the auditing?
The government auditing standards requires a quality assurance process. Peer reviewers look to make sure that that is followed. And if you don't follow it, then you're subject to decertification. A person not on the audit team, not involved in the audit, whether they're internal or external to the organization, is supposed to be able to go through all the work papers and the audit report, and looking at the work papers come to the same conclusion the auditors have made. If the findings are not corroborated by sufficient, credible, and relevant evidence, then the quality assurance person will make a note that this audit finding is not supported, in which case the auditee cannot, auditor either has to drop the finding or has to do more work to support the audit finding. Having said that, until the quality assurance person signs off on the notes and signs off on the report cannot be released.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that overview, because I think, we've heard much about how Yellow Book standards are followed and applied to the auditing process by our Office of the State Auditor. So I'm going to open this up now to members. And members, we have Mr. Young here for another hour and a half. We could go longer, but I would also like to keep our eye on the time. So I'm thinking about an hour and a half of questioning. So Representative Tarnas.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Young, for participating with us today. I really appreciate it. I want to understand, we heard from an earlier testimony today about various things that he discovered in his process and his investigations that came up with something that he thought were questionable transactions, and he brought it to the auditor, and he wasn't quite sure how the auditor followed up on it. What do you see as being the responsibility of the auditor to follow up on what was brought to him as potential questionable transactions? I mean, leave it at that. And what is the process the auditor needs to go through in order to determine, should we follow up on this? Should we pursue it?
In answer to your question, the Yellow Book is very specific. If you find fraud, you're required to document it, to the effects, provide evidence that fraud occurred, and to report it in your audit report. And now if management does not report it, they are in violation of the Yellow Book standards.
Thank you. I appreciate your clarity. Let me turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Representative Okimoto?
No questions. Thank you, Chair.
Representative Kobayashi?
Thank you, Chair. So just following up on what the generalities that Representative Tarnas was asking, specifically, one of the issues we've been facing, or that was raised with the assistant auditor who had in there last week, was related to a fraudulent email that related to a land transfer document with a forged signature. And there was some discussion as to whether that should have been disclosed in the audit report.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, but this came up before your committee as well. Your committee to look at the auditor work separate from this.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, before you answer that, just to make, so I can clear the record, it's not a forged email, it's a forged easement. A forged easement, not a forged email. I just want to clear that up.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes. Yes.
You know which one I'm
Yeah,
talking
yes,
about, right?
I know
Very
which
well.
is.
So no confusion on that at all.
No. Yeah.
So in this case, you had a situation where a year prior to the audit, this whole situation came to light. Was referred to the Attorney General. They prosecuted it. So, but there was still some insistence that after the fact, a year after everybody knew, that they should have let everybody know again.
Yeah.
And I know this was addressed in your earlier audit or your earlier committee work on the auditor on this potential fraud issue.
Yeah. If I had been in that row and one of the auditors brought me to my attention of fraud, I'm obligated by Yellow Book standards to follow up on it, to document it, to preserve any evidence that I have. And once the audit report is issued, to release it to the investigators and the prosecutors for follow-up. The evidence, investigators will, like the FBI, will use our work papers as a starting point for their investigations because they're trying to establish that a crime did occur. If they can establish crime has occurred, then they would turn it over to the prosecutors for prosecution beyond a reasonable doubt. But the auditors are not in a row to run the investigation or to maintain the custody of evidence that is mandatory in order for the evidence to be admitted in court. The auditors have an obligation to develop the fraud, to document the fraud, and to return it over to the investigators. In working with the SBA investigators and a district attorney in San Francisco and several other investigators, the skill set we bring as auditors is to develop the evidence that is needed for prosecution. The investigators will then take our work papers to build the case and also to continue with the legal process for prosecution. It is not the role of the auditors to prosecute or to determine what will be investigated. It is our obligation under Yellow Book standards to document that fraud occurred.
So, sorry, maybe my question wasn't clear enough, but what I was asking was, in situations where everybody is already aware of this, has already been prosecuted, would you still have that same opinion?
Yes, you're still required to report it in your audit report.
Okay, even though it's old news.
Correct.
So more than anybody else, having been the chair of the prior committee, looking at the work of the auditor, that you came up with, what was it, like a 50-page report or so on it? What, just, you didn't make a blanket statement or agree yes or no. Do you find the auditor to be a corrupt and crooked individual in relation to the audits that he's performing?
It's like a doctor criticizing another doctor.
That's what you did in the report, right? It was not possible.
Our audit report basically details the problems we ran into in a scope limitations and the methodology from pages 2 to 6. Without repeating all the problems we ran into, let me say that there's a proper way to act professionally, and there's an improper way of being the poster child for how not to work with auditees and with the legislative arm. And Mr. Kondo and his behavior so far, if the newspaper articles are correct, is the poster child for bad auditing. Okay,
and that's based on the work that you performed with that other audit. And what became of that audit report? I mean, I thought the idea was that it was supposed to result in some action, but I haven't really seen anything.
Yeah, let me correct that. It was not an audit report. We fully disclosed to Mr. Kondo what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. He refused to respond to our communications. He went directly to the press and made false and misleading statements, misconstrued the facts, and basically acted very unprofessionally in the way that he handled the work we're doing. It was not an audit report. We're commissioned to do a study for the speaker. We treated it as a study. The government auditing standard did not apply. We tried to use audit protocols to try to keep him informed. He refused to participate in our discussions. And so we treated it as a research paper, and based on information in the public media, we were able to write the report. Absent access to public information, we were denied access to any information in his office, all under the umbrella. We're independent, objective, and they're confidential. There are many ways of releasing confidential information without compromising the laws and restrictions that prevent you from seeing the information. And peer reviews and third parties have access to that under many other audit offices.
I mean, you've been an auditor for a long time, so was I, so was Mr. Kondo. And based on all, the audits that you've done, all the years we spent in auditing, you stand by that statement that this was just an egregious process where the auditor is just really unqualified? That's your...
let me correct that statement and what you're saying. Nobody likes to be audited, and worse, to have auditors audit auditors. That's the worst situation you can be. But no matter how critical it is, you take those comments and those criticisms and constructive criticisms, hopefully, and use it to improve your operations. You don't lambaste or attack or do character assassination or try to undermine the information they're conveying to you that you need to improve your operations. If you are attacking the individual and you resort to that type of technique of character assassination and intimidation, but you don't question the validity of the facts and figures that are presented in the report, you as an auditor know that your audit results are valid because they never once, as Mr. Condor, never once questioned the facts and figures we had in our report. You may vary and differ on the conclusions, but the facts and figures were never in question.
It sounds like you don't like him very much. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
I don't know. Can you rephrase the question?
Sounds like you really have dislike for Mr. Kondo.
No, as I said before, personally, I like the guy. But professionally, I think he begs the question of being a professional auditor.
And you would, in your opinion, is that something that would be shared by most government auditors that you know in the profession?
I can't speak for them.
So it's possible that's just your opinion, but it's just not that obvious to you.
We've had speakers in many of our professional organizations speak. He's very likable. I had due respect. I gave him fair play. But based on the last few months, basically eroded all respect I had for him.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Representative Yamashita.
I'm okay at this time.
Representative Hashem. Okay. Representative Perruso. No.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Young, for being with us. So I wanted to circle back to a question that the chair had raised, just so that I understand completely. She was talking about the process by which auditors seek guidance from legislators once an audit has been approved and funded. And I wanted to understand what you said, because I think that your response had more to do with legislators providing information that could be used in an audit. And I heard her question as that conversation that happens that I understand happen between the auditor and the legislators to further specify the focus of the audit. Okay. So can you speak to that piece?
Sure. I don't know if you've read a copy of this and attributes. Yes. So basically, no one is an island. We've learned through the audit profession that the General Accountability Office, after it's got its budget cut and staffing cut, because they are not responsive to the U.S. Congress and the needs of the Congress, that's rippled down all the way down to the city and county level. The auditors have a boss. The boss is the legislative arm, whether it's a city council, a state legislature, or the U.S. Congress. It requires communications with the individual oversight body. We, as a practice, talk to the city council all the time, explaining to them what we're doing, how we're doing it. This is our audit progress, and also to asking for definition of what they want and refining the audit objectives and scope. In the past, the state auditor also did that with the state legislature. Mr. Kondo has taken it upon himself to misuse the mantra, we're independent and objective, to hide their substandard performance and their inability to conduct performance audits.
Well, that last comment aside, I was really asking about, so I'm interested in the role of the legislators in this process.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in improving our work. And so do you think there are examples or instances wherein legislators have inappropriately guided audits for political purposes? I mean, is that, I mean, and you don't have to give me any examples, but I am curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. And it is true, U.S. Congress and state legislatures and council members, being politicians, can and influence and bias an audit and the results of an audit. This is where the Yellow Book Standards is very important, because it basically says the auditors have to be independent and objective. You must have credible evidence, relevant evidence, and sufficient evidence to substantiate your audit findings. If you don't, you cannot include it in your report, regardless of the external influences that are exerted on you. Having said that, many audit bodies have learned that to ignore the legislative body, your bosses, is like playing with fire, and you're going to be outsourced or you're going to be closed down, which has happened in several cities, including one of the most outstanding audit offices in the nation, Palo Alto. They no longer have an audit office because they fought with the city council. They had an adversarial relationship that said, we are independent and objective. We don't have to answer to you. We don't have to do anything you asked of us. It's like telling your boss, I don't care, you're my boss. I'm going to do whatever I want. And in the old days, you could get away with it. And they went on fishing expeditions to come up with an audit report that did not answer the audit objectives that Congress had asked or address the issues that Congress had asked. In order to justify their existence, you have to be responsive to your legislative arm, to your oversight body. But the legislative body also has an obligation to ensure that the audit office performance is acceptable and that they are doing and answering questions that the legislative office is asking. And in some cases, they've gone so far, as the city council as city charter has put in, that we will write the auditor's annual performance to say yay, nay, or indifferent. This legislative body, the state legislature, has an obligation to also exercise their initiative to ensure that the state auditor is responsive to their needs.
Thank you, Chair.
Representative Ichiyama.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Auditor Young, very much for being here today. One of the things that has come out about, in particular, the SLDF and ADC audits was that when the draft reports were finalized and sent to the agencies for their review, that the final recommendations were not included with those drafts. And I think that had created on the agency's part some confusion when the recommendations were finally published, because they never had the opportunity to discuss them with the audit team to find out what they really meant. And I was wondering and curious, are there Yellow Book standards or professional standards about whether recommendations should be included in a draft that's sent to an auditee?
Yes, you cannot issue the draft report until management has had a chance to respond to it, to provide their inputs. And if they haven't responded and it's not in final form, you cannot release it. So the recommendations are mandatory because the auditors by Yellow Book standards are required to follow up on the recommendations a year or 2 years later to see whether the recommendations have been implemented. and in order to close out the recommendations if they have been implemented. If you don't have any recommendations, you don't have a report.
So just to confirm what I hear that you're saying is that a report, even in draft form, is incomplete without the recommendations.
Correct.
Because the recommendations are what the agency is measured on in follow-up on the audit.
Yeah.
And so I think then in these cases with the SLDF and ADC audits, it put the agencies at a disadvantage that they were not able to review the recommendations until it came out publicly.
I would say that not only were auditing standards violated, but the reports are not credible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Representative Tarnas, back to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us today, and thank you for helping us understand what the Yellow Book Standards is requesting us to do. You know, I wonder about, we have the auditor's team going out and getting information and bringing back, for example, this morning we heard about questionable transactions, for example. And he presented to the auditor the evidence that he had for questionable transactions. And it's up to the auditor to decide whether or not to pursue them. From the Yellow Book Standards, I understand they're just guidelines, but what is the process that the auditor would then use to follow up on these questionable transactions and the evidence of these in order to determine whether or not to pursue them? I'm just concerned. I'm not an auditor. I'm just trying to understand from the public's perspective, are we actually following up on all the evidence that we are presented with?
Let me answer that by saying the GAGA standards are not guidelines. They're mandatory requirements for government auditors to follow. Violate this, you risk de-accreditation of your office. And in the standards, it states that when in the professional judgment fraud has occurred, the auditor is required to report the fraud and to consult with authorities or legal counsel about whether reporting the fraud will compromise any investigations or legal proceedings. Unquote.
Thank you for that explanation. I mean, that just raises my level of concern about the lack of follow-up on these, the presentation from contracted officials who have presented to the auditor potential violations or potential questionable transactions, and then I didn't see any follow-up. So I'm concerned about that, and what you've described to me as the Yellow Book Standards show that there really should have been more follow-up. Am I characterizing that properly?
Absolutely. They're required by Yellow Book Standards to follow up on the audit and document it to the extent possible, and also document the effects of that fraud.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Representative Okimoto? No questions at all? Do you think? No, none? Okay. Representative Kobayashi?
No questions.
Okay. Representative Yamashita? Representative Hashem? Representative Perruso? Yes, go ahead.
So I thank you for being here because you're helping me clear up a lot of questions. My next one has to do with the distinction between findings and recommendations.
Sure.
So when I look back at follow-ups on audits that were completed by the auditor. So let's say they do an initial audit and then they do a follow-up review.
Yes.
What I see them addressing in that follow-up is never the recommendations, it's always the findings. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because our committee has also had a conversation on that. And I have been thinking that the recommendations are really like, that's for the legislature to think about. I mean, I feel like
Yes, yeah.
I feel like it's the legislature's prerogative to determine the direction of change.
Right.
But the agency has to deal with the findings.
Right. And you're not alone in that. Many people misunderstand the syllogism, criteria, condition, cause, effect, recommendation. The auditor is responsible for establishing criteria, cause, impact, and making a recommendation that addresses the cause of their problem in their analysis and their determination. Implementing the recommendation is a role of management. If, for example, the legislature wants to get involved and they find that criteria needs to be changed, then they can change the criteria. That's the basis of an audit report. The findings follow-up report, or recommendation follow-up report, which is just a fancy name for saying we don't know what else to do, so we're going to do a follow-up report on the recommendation. That means that there's a lack of risk analysis by the individual audit office, a lack of written audit plans, a lack of understanding and planning so that they have a master plan for the audits for the succeeding year and for the following years after that. Those who are properly managed will have a master plan based on the risk assessment of what are the priority areas that need to be audited during the course of the year. Resolutions get first priority, but in the absence of resolutions, they can go to the audit plan to determine which is the number one priority, which is the number two priority, which is the number three priority, and which one is a low priority item. Organizations that don't have an audit plan or have not done a risk assessment or don't know what to do will fall back to the position of, let's do a follow-up audit on the recommendation and let's see what we can come up with. Or they will say, well, we did an audit on this particular issue before. Let's do another audit to see what's happened to it. The redundant audits and low priority audits is an indication the office is not effectively planning its audit work.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, but my question was really about you just said they would be doing a follow-up on the recommendations.
Yes.
And the only follow-up reports I've read have been follow-ups on the findings.
Correct. And the intent of the Yellow Book standard on follow-up recommendations is, has the problem been resolved? Can you close the recommendation out? Has it been fully implemented? In which case the auditor will report, recommendation closed, problem solved, forget it. If, for example, they say, well, let's do additional audit work to see if there are other problems out there, it's basically an excuse for extending the audit report on the recommendation to come up with another product that was never envisioned or never planned, either by the audit office or by the legislature.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to defer to Representative Okimoto and then Representative.
Thank you. Just kind of following up. Thank you, Auditor Young. I wanted to understand, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you said in the good old days that was allowed, and with Perruso's question, there seemed to be like a pattern of this kind of behavior. Is there other instances where you've seen difficulties that you recognize with Auditor Kondo?
I don't want to attack personalities. I'm not at that level of getting in the gutter unprofessionally with anybody. Let's say we disagree with some of the things he's done. We provided advice to him on how to do things based on modern auditing standards, and he's preferred to stay in the glacial ages of auditing, which is back in the 1970s. I've been around for 45 years auditing, and I would shake my head at some of the things that he does. Intimidation tactics that he uses, some practices he uses are no longer acceptable in the auditing profession.
And this was isolated just with him, not with other auditors?
Let's say, I'm going to keep it on a professional level.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Representative Ichiyama.
You provided us with a document that talks about some attributes of dysfunctional audit offices.
Yes.
And maybe can you explain what this is about and what it's based on?
what I tried to help provide as a tool for the committee is based on 45 years of auditing and conducting of peer reviews across the nation. Auditors' offices that have underperformed have usually used the mantra, we're independent and objective and you can't tell us what to do. These are some of the attributes that some of these offices had. Some of them have been, their functions have been outsourced because they were no longer considered responsive to the legislature or to the city council. And many of them use these tactics in order to justify their existence. They have to be value added and they have to be telling management something that they need in order to improve the operation and public administration of their government entity. If they're just redundant and saying the same old thing and telling management what they already know, that's not value added. I'll give you an example of what we did, the paratransit audit, for example. Everybody was complaining about the paratransit being delayed and having to wait unnecessarily long time and not being picked up. So when we went in there, we analyzed the entire operations from beginning to end within the timeframes given us, and we discovered that the dispatchers were using the automated logarithm to establish a schedule, but being friendly and helpful to others, people who called in last minute were given a pickup time, which disrupted the entire schedule. As a result, they were not picked up or if they were delayed in picking up. That kind of insight is what auditors can and should be doing to help improve the administration of government entities. And that is what we did. And as a result, the city council is very happy with the work that we did. If there's our complaints or shortcomings in it, they let us know, and we made improvements in our system in order to help be responsive to the legislature.
I just wanted to follow up on an earlier comment you made about the yellow book standards is mandatory, and if an auditor's office fails to follow them, they could be de-accredited. And then I think you alluded in the beginning of your statements to how de-accreditation can affect potentially our bond rating, sure, our financial statements. Can you walk me through that and help me understand that?
Sure. An easy example is a city auditor's position working for the city council. Many audit offices are required to oversee and administer the contracts for financial audits, just as the state auditor is required to oversee the financial audits of state financial statements. Having a lack of accreditation means that your endorsement and your release of the audit report is no longer credible. Having known people who work for the credit agencies, if your financial statements are no longer credible, regardless of who signs off on it, it's going to affect your credit ratings. If, for example, your credit rating is lowered from AA plus to A, you're going to have to pay a higher interest rate on your bonds in order to get hedge funds and other investors to purchase your bonds. Having to pay a higher interest rate, you will have to set aside larger amounts for debt service to pay off the loans. That is one of the reasons why the city and county of Honolulu has improved and focused so much on their credit ratings and have policies and procedures on what their credit rating should be and how much debt they are permitted to release to ensure that they are investment grade and they pay the lowest interest. I think on the last go around, they saved something like $40 million on the interest rate because they had such a high credit rating and they were able to take advantage of the lower interest rates.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Jen.
Members, I have two questions to wrap up, but I wanted to allow any of you folks to ask any final questions. Rep Tarnas, Rep Kobayashi, and then Rep Yamashita. And then is there any more? You can say yes, yes? Okay.
A real quick question. I really appreciate your comments, Mr. Young, about how the relationship between the state government, its auditor, and its credit ratings are integrally linked. Could you just give us some advice on how Hawaii can do a better job in managing our relationship amongst these, the legislature, the auditor, so that we can actually do a good job and be able to have a good bond rating, because I don't want to cost us tens of millions of dollars, right? So what can we do? And the public is asking the same question.
Yeah.
So any advice for us, Mr. Young?
It's like raising children. I mean, you know, if you have an adversarial relationship with your children, no matter what you say, they're not going to listen to you. It takes two parties on both sides of the conversation to communicate, and the dialogue cannot occur unless they're willing to change and compromise and build on it. Absent that, no matter what one side does, the other side, if it's not willing to cooperate, you have very few options.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. As a parent of several children, you know, I appreciate that it's a two-way street. And so I will endeavor to incorporate that advice as we move forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Young. And back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair Tarnas. Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you. So off that last exchange, one would come to the conclusion that you think it's a realistic risk that because of some deviation from the standards of the Yellow Book, that would result in a decertification for the auditor, and that would result in bond downgrade for the state of Hawaii, and that you stand behind that as a realistic scenario. Really?
Let me put it this way. That's a potential scenario if you're willing to risk it. Yeah, go ahead. The city's not willing to play that kind of relationship because it can't afford to gamble like that. There are anti-speculation policies in many city government investment written policies and procedures that say you avoid speculation. But let me answer that by saying Palo Alto took the attitude, we're holier than thou, we're not going to answer to the city council. They no longer exist as an audit entity. Their audit functions were outsourced. You know, they understand, and in teaching students, trying to differentiate between public accounting and governmental accounting is two different universes. And they have a very difficult time being able to cross with a path because they think in terms of FASB, they cannot understand GASB. And GASB is a totally different independent organization from FASB.
Of course. So the
when
you were talking about what I'm talking about is the realistic. I mean, I have a colleague here that seems to think it's a huge concern that we could get downgraded because of this. You do know that that's something that's never occurred, or even to go on a watch list for downgrade in the history of municipal bond markets.
I'm not going to speculate on what could happen.
It has not. I'll tell you that. Coming from municipal bond markets, it's not a realistic scenario. It really is not.
Yeah, I'll leave it to you and your decision as to what you want to do. But your mother understands the importance of the bond ratings.
She's not in bond markets, I don't think she knows, but I am.
Okay. Any further questions, Mr. Kobayashi? Representative Yamashita.
Thank you, Chair. Just to help me understand a little bit more about the accreditation and how it works. So who does it, how often it's done, and most importantly, what exactly are they looking for?
The peer review committee is usually an independent group of volunteers from the organization it belongs to. For example, the City and County of Honolulu belongs to the Association of Local Government Auditors. Under Yellow Book standards, we're required to have a peer review every 3 years. Absent a certification or the issuance of a letter by the Association of Local Government Auditors, we, in essence, would lose our accreditation and would be reluctant to issue audit report under GAGAS. We could try releasing audit reports, but the acceptance by the rest of the auditing profession would be questionable because we are not in compliance with GAGAS, the Government generally accepted government auditing standards. The state auditor belongs to a different organization, I think the National Association of State and Treasury Auditors. And they basically have, through that organization, a peer review every 3 years. I think they're scheduled for one in a couple of years. The first thing the peer review committee will ask is, give us a copy of your auditing standards, policies, and procedures, written policies, up to date. And if it's obsolete or doesn't exist, the next question would be, how are you assuring your office is operating in compliance with good Yellow Book standards? And then the questions will follow after that. If you don't know what the audit standards are and you don't understand what the government auditing standards are, and you don't understand the audit life cycle, how can you be issuing audit reports under Yellow Book standards? And is your reports in compliance with the government auditing standards? Do you comply? Are your audit findings valid? Are your audit reports accurate? And those questions will raise, and if those questions are raised, then definitely you will have a hard time convincing your peer review committee that you're in compliance with the government auditing standards.
Thank you. You also, and I've heard this, and it's been explained to me before, but maybe could you explain to this committee what is the difference between government accounting, government auditing, and public?
Public accountants, like corporations, you issue financial statements, cash flow statements, income statements, balance sheets. But that's under the Federal Accounting Standards Board and the CPA rules. But government auditing standards are totally different. And you're issuing financial statements called comprehensive annual financial reports. And in it, it's a blend of component entities within the government, as well as all your operations. It shows change in cash flow and change in asset valuations. It's going to sound strange here, but let me give you an example. For the city and county of Honolulu, you have the operations, then you have the quasi-governmental heart, the bus, and those systems. Those are component elements of the city operations. Those are segregated in the comprehensive financial report so that their operations and their profit and loss are shown differently in the audit reports. But yet, the city pays $170 million to support the bus. So that's an internal transfer of funds, and that is shown in the CAFR. Financial statements may or may not, for the private sector, may or may not show that, but they're very simplistic compared to the CAFR. You have to understand how to analyze it, how to report it, what the economic trends are, what the demographics are, where the investment grades are, what their debt service ratios are. And it's in the appendix, you get lost in the details, but it's very comprehensive. And that is what the credit agency, rating agencies look at in order to give you your credit rating. So it's a thick book, is about that thick.
Representative Hashem.
Auditor Young, I'm looking at your page that you sent us, some attributes of dysfunctional audit offices, and I read your audit report. Can you go over? I read your report, your audit on the auditor, basically.
The working group audit report. Yeah. It's not an audit report, it's a staff report.
There was some of these things in there on this list that you found about the auditor's office. Can you touch into that, which some of this dysfunctional audit office, like no written audit procedures or obsolete practices? You've been saying.
The study report is based on public information. Let me make it clear. It's not an audit report. It's a staff report to the speaker, the House Speaker. What he just, once it was given to him, it was his option as to what he wanted to do with it. He chose to publicly release it. That's his decision. It was not our intent. It was not our desire, but basically just to give an insight of what our analysis showed of the state auditor's operations. Having said that, So what we itemized in the staff report was some of the things that needed to be done to improve the operations of the office as we understood it and based on the interviews and work we did. Subsequent to that, for the assistance of the committee, I started thinking, what is it that you need to know in order to understand the attributes of a dysfunctional office to prevent the closure of the office or even the outsourcing of its operations, as has happened in Stockton and Palo Alto and San Bernardino and elsewhere, and even Oklahoma. And what I prepared was a list after the staff report was issued. It basically said, these are the signs, the red flags that individuals should be looking for in order to prevent the loss of your audit function.
What red flags does our office have, our audit office have?
Putting me on the spot. To begin with, here, you don't have any written audit policies and procedures. What you have in writing is 20 years out of date, hasn't been updated. He will not share a copy of the audit policies and procedures with anyone, including the working group. So there is no assurance that his office is operating under Yellow Book standards. There is no assurance that he is complying with the Yellow Book standards. There's no assurance that when the peer review is conducted in the near future, that he will be certified again to continue as an audit office. The inability to confirm compliance with auditing standards are major red flags for that office. As we state in our study report, is inconsistent leadership and decision-making and inconsistent audit processes have resulted in significant personnel turnover in that office. If an office is losing personnel at 40% or more, those are red flags that something's wrong with the office. There's attempts to intimidate not only people who are there to provide constructive criticism, but also your operations is an indication that his leadership is authoritarian, outdated, and he rules by intimidation. If you want that kind of leadership, fine, but that's not the way the audit profession works. The audit profession is open, transparent, communicates with the staff, encourages the staff to take risks, to take on new projects, to innovate. And even if you don't have any experience in, say, information technology auditing, to help you develop the skill set so that you can do it. We don't see that going on. And based on what we've been told, it doesn't occur in that organization. If you want a modern office able to respond directly to your needs and your objectives, you have to have the most updated techniques and capabilities within that office. For example, how many of you can do data analytics? Who's teaching them data analytics? Yet in the profession, heavy emphasis being put on data analytics, the use of Tableau, the use of many of the software that can instantly answer your question in seconds instead of months. And we don't see that capability existing in the state auditor's office. If you were to ask the employees to explain the audit life cycle, to write and defend an audit report, and to explain the audit policies and procedures, they would not be able to do so as far as we could determine. And so the litany continues in management, leadership, audit planning and operations, the lack of an audit plan, the lack of a risk assessment, untimely reports, and a non-responsiveness to the legislature, and blaming others for their inability to perform are red flags, real strong red flags that the legislature has to take action to resolve these problems. Otherwise, the situation will continue and your audit reports, no matter how attention they're getting and how much press they receive, will be questionable. I, as an auditor, would question many of the audit results that are released because they have all the attributes of a dysfunctional office.
much. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. Perruso, last question.
Yes. So thank you for this conversation. I wanted to ask, I think across the country, there's a lot more focus at the level of state legislatures on oversight. We're seeing that in the Council for State Governments. More attention is being paid to this issue. And I think there's strong intention to move in that direction for us as well. And I'm wondering if you can think of an exemplary state that kind of models the kind of work that you think that should be done. And I'm thinking like not just on the part of the auditor, which is really your focus, but also in terms of the legislative work and the role of the legislators in that oversight process.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Auditors are not perfect, but if they're doing their job, they're willing to say, I don't know everything, I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to improve, and willing to take constructive criticism to do a better job. That's all you can ask for. Even some of the best offices in the nation have gone by the wayside. As I mentioned, Palo Alto is outsourced because they developed a holier than thou attitude that has so offended the city council that they were outsourced. They no longer exist. And so I could recommend certain offices, but there's no guarantee that they'll still be in existence tomorrow. But I think that the legislature needs to answer the question, what do we want from an office that is responsive to our needs and it provides audit reports that are issued timely so we can make timely decisions on and vote properly on legislation? What is it that we need from an audit office that tells us what we don't know and that can help us improve the public administration of this government?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I think those are great framing questions. I'm going to turn to Vice Chair Ichiyama and then I'll wrap up. Okay. This has been very enlightening, Mr. Young. I want to talk a little bit more about some specifics and then end on a broader comment about professional judgment, because I really like the way that, I wish I could end on Rep. Perruso's question, but I have these questions. I want to end on your thoughts about what is good professional judgment. So the specific questions first. To pull this back, Chair Tarnas has already expressed my lines of questioning about the concerns raised with rail, because that is the largest public works project in the state of Hawaii that has involved now billions of dollars of taxpayer money. So he's asked those questions, but I want to pull back into the concerns raised by the ADC and the SLDF audits. So one of my concerns is an omission in the ADC audit. And here, this might be the fault of the legislature because we were so broad in our resolution asking the auditor, just look at ADC. When you look at that, that's what the authorizing resolution says. But is it a concern that when we look at the work of the audit, that a significant piece of the lands managed by ADC that are arguably the best lands for farming in this state, which are coming due with their licensings by tenants, would that have raised a concern for you as the auditor to maybe look at that subject matter and spend some time to analyze it and present information to the legislative body that has been very vague about what you should be looking at?
Let me answer that question by saying, when I worked for the federal government, we're required to file annual financial statements. And we did it at city and county level as well. If I owned one stock of AT&T, I was perceived by the lawyers as having a conflict of interest and could not audit or be involved in any audit related to AT&T. Having said that, if the Yellow Book standards require, if you have a conflict of interest, you have to disclose it and back out of the audit. If any conflicts of interest existed, the audit should not have been done by Mr. Kondo's office, or he should have appointed people who were not involved or familiar with the people involved in the operation of that entity. If, for example, we have a personal relationship or a relative that we know that's involved in the organization and we're tasked to audit them, I have to recuse myself. I cannot audit that individual.
Okay, I think I appreciate that because conflict of interest, I'm very interested in those areas too. But I guess the question for me was a subject matter question,
Yes.
because the omission wasn't an omission of conflicts of interest, but it was an omission of very significant policy matters with the ADC audit. And I apologize, you may not be familiar, and we didn't give you all the context.
I'm not familiar with them. Yeah.
But so with that scenario, if you're auditing an agency and you don't look at a significant portion of their portfolio, would that have raised a red flag for you as an auditor?
Yes and no. It would depend on what the audit program said. They're required to have a written audit plan of the subject matter based on the objectives that were given to them. If there wasn't a written audit plan, it's difficult to render an opinion.
Okay, so that would be something that we would need to maybe follow up
So
on.
you would have to want to look at their work papers to see what they're planning to do.
Okay.
As to whether it's prime land or not, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Second area of concern that was raised, we learned that in the SLDF audit, there was a licensee or a lessee whose nonprofit status was lost in the course of having an active contract. Would that have raised a red flag for you to do some further investigation if it was a term of the contract?
Those would be appropriate questions the auditors should have been asking. Who, what, when, where, why, and if the easement was granted or to a nonprofit, what was the rationale? Was it the decision? Show me the documents that were used to support the decision. Absent that, I would guess it would be a red flag. Okay,
and then that would be something that would be documented in the working papers at the very least, just to say that it was raised, addressed, researched, and maybe resolved in such a manner in accordance with Yellow Book standards.
Conceptually, yes. And I'll give you another example on HART. When we found that there were over 200 modifications to the major contract, it resulted in $450 million in increased costs to the rail system. We asked the questions, where is your computer system so we can analyze what happened? And also, where is your documentation to show us the rationale for these change orders and what was intended to achieve? They could not produce any written documentary evidence to support their decision-making, their change orders. The information systems was incomplete and inaccurate, so we could not validate the contract status or what transpired to the contract. And that was the basis for our saying, if fraud were to occur in the HART system, they would not be able to detect it or resolve it because they don't know when fraud was, the system was, internal controls was so materially weak that fraud could occur and they wouldn't know it.
Thank you. Actually, you've answered a question that I didn't ask yet, but which was related to the HART. So in your situation where your office audited the HART system, you dealt with the issue of the change orders and reported it in your audit report. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did 3 audits on HART and we continue to say your internal controls are deficient, your material control, management controls are weak, and fraud could occur at any moment, and they ignored us.
Okay, but then you did also pursue that line of questioning through further documentary evidence, interviews.
Correct. We tried to, and when we couldn't, then we basically told management, you got to start improving your systems. And the FBI picked up on it and contacted us to say, can we go through your work papers? Because we're going to initiate an investigation. And that was before the state auditor's office got involved.
Okay, thank you. I think you actually answered. So my question, one last question on concerns raised. So there has been some suggestion that, well, the DLNR had already known about the forged easement, had taken care of it. There's an actually open question if the fieldwork members understood that to have happened. The timeline that we have constructed was that the initial interview, it appears that the auditing fieldwork staff did not know about the fraud, which was September 2017. At that point, the prosecution was still ongoing. And then the second indication we have that the auditor's fieldwork team realized there was a forged document was October 2018, at which point there does seem to have been some closure with the criminal case, but there was still the existence of the forged easement on the records of the Bureau of Conveyances. Does that situation cause a red flag for further follow-up by the auditing team that could have happened?
Yeah, and that's where proper oversight and supervision is important on the GAGIT standards. If the audit team members were not aware, the supervisor should have been aware of it. And if the red flag had been raised, he should have followed up on it and addressed it. Without access to the work papers, we don't know what transpired.
Okay, so thank you for that. I know that this investigative committee appreciates your testimony and will be looking very closely at the Yellow Book standards. And my hope is that we do get a copy of the manual of guides from the office so that we can be reassured that this office is acting in accordance with government auditing standards. But absent that, I am very concerned in light of this testimony that we have today. I want to end on a higher note because I know that the auditing profession is a profession that the legislature relies heavily upon, and that independence and objectivity, which is the features that we want in the office of the auditor, is those principles that we want guiding them. But there's also a principle of professional judgment. So could you speak to all of those principles, professional judgment, independence, objectivity? What is it? What are those qualities that we should look for in the office of the auditor and in their policies and procedures?
Those are attributes that auditors should have: integrity, candidness, principles, ethical behavior, professional decorum. And absent those, it's hard to say what is acceptable. It's depending on the legislature. But the auditors are deemed by many as being role models for their organization, and they should be above reproach. If they violate the ethical standards or the government auditing standards, then retribution should occur. And if absent retribution, then their oversight body is not doing their job.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Members, if there's no further questions, we are done here with the witness. We do have some procedural matters, but I do want to thank Mr. Young for being here. And Mr. Young, just so you know, we are going to be conducting more hearings. And so now as a subpoenaed witness, you will be invited to Zoom in on any of those meetings, as well as present us with questions. And then we may in fact have to call you back. Our timeline is to have a report circulated to people who have been subpoenaed, hopefully sometime in December, so that we have some time to get some feedback before we have to present the final report to the State House of Representatives in January. So on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Young. You can stay there as we conduct our final matters of business. Members, I just want to apprise you. So at our last hearing, ADC has already begun to prepare some further documents in response to our request. If members would be so kind, pursuant to our rules, the committee may delegate to myself, the chair, the authority to specify the time and place at which the person subpoenaed is to attend and give testimony, and to designate the books, records, documents, or other evidence required by the committee to be produced. If you would so indulge me, if you would allow a vote to delegate authority to me for this limited subpoena ducis tecum to ADC on the documents that they have already agreed to provide at our last hearing. I don't want to say in error what it is that we're requesting of them, but they've already actually started to prepare them and have turned in some of those documents to us. So this is more kind of just a pro forma vote to delegate authority to me to be able to issue the subpoena ducis tecum, and I will do so tomorrow if that's okay with the committee. So the request is to delegate authority for this limited purpose of issuing a subpoena ducis tecum to ADC. Any questions or concerns, Vice Chair?
Chair's recommendation is to issue uses TCOM as noted. Chair, Vice Chair vote aye. Rep. Hashem.
Aye.
Rep. Kobayashi.
Aye.
Rep. Perruso. Aye. Rep. Tarnas.
Aye.
Rep. Yamashita. Rep. Okimoto. Aye. Chair, the recommendation is adopted.
Thank you, members. Pursuant to our schedule of hearings that hearing dates I gave you for last week and individual members' travel schedules, I'm going to be hoping to issue a meeting for Tuesday, November 9th, so that we can issue further subpoenas. And the plan is, members, is that the last body of individuals that we really need to talk to are the board members involved at DLNR and ADC as the final set of witnesses to ask questions of, as well as BKD, as I indicated this morning with our conversation with Mr. Lee. So that's the last set of testifiers I believe we're going to be looking at. And so I'm going to release you from the Friday, November 12th date, but then if we can still hold the Wednesday, November 17th and Thursday, November 18th dates. We might need to add a few more dates in November if we have overflow of some witnesses. And then in December, we're also going to have some meetings to finalize the report, the recommendations, both as the draft and the final. So that's kind of what our timeline is at the moment. Representative Perruso.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned talking to board members, but I was wondering if we would have a chance to hear from community, from Kauai, especially members of the Joint Fact-Finding Committee, and Mike Faya from KAA. I would be especially interested to hear or to be able to ask him some questions.
Yes, we can certainly add those groups of people. I will reserve, just because for purely community folks, sometimes they are not amenable to subpoenas, but we can certainly have that conversation because we do want the community at large to be more involved in this process. So I will continue to work with members on how we do that. And, you know, we have an aggressive schedule, but I do think that we are going to be able to accomplish what we can according to our own rules and what's expected of us in January.
Thank you.
Okay. Members, seeing no further business before this committee, have a happy Halloween, safe travels for those of you who are traveling, and we'll see you via Zoom on November 9th. Thank you. You're adjourned.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.